I can remember Dad struggling with rats in that Adolph's house, and they were gigantic rats. There was one that was particularly big, and during the night, he would leave a candle or something out so he could see, and he watched this rat, and the rat was so smart that he couldn't trap it. And we had this slop pail, which in those days you didn't have sinks and running water and stuff, so when you got through washing dishes and stuff, you dumped this water in the slop pail. And the rat would come in during the night and try to eat stuff and drink out of that slop pail and stuff. And so one morning, he came up to he used to come upstairs to get us up, go to school. Remember how nice that was? Dad used to come and get us up. Because we slept good in those days. We were always warm in that place. We didn't have the sleeping problems then that we had now. Why is that?
Get into that later.
But anyway, I can remember the morning when he came up and he said, I caught the big rat last night. And that was a big deal.
How did he do it?
Well,
He killed it with one of the kids' doll beds. Broke the doll bed in 1,000
anyway,
pieces.
he got it. I think he got it in a trap and then he killed it afterwards. But I mean, he set a trap. But he was always trying to, see, the rat was so smart he would avoid this trap. And so he had to really be a genius about it.
Okay, what about Christmas at Adolph's house?
Okay, well that was some of the happiest times of those Christmases, because the Mother's Brothers in Chicago would send us big boxes of toys and stuff.
And Lena and Ella from St. Paul.
And one time, one of the things they sent this one Christmas, I remember, was a whole box of Milky Way candy bars, one of those brands. And Mother had just set that at the bottom of the stairway, on the stair landing there. And we would run down there and get another candy bar, and all we wanted. And that was one Christmas I think Mother was pretty happy, because I think we had a pretty good Christmas that year. But anyway, so we had, and I can remember also at the Adolph's house when one day when Dad said to me, he says, "Come on," he said, "I want to show you something." And so he had this little log cabin syrup thing can. There were metal cans with a chimney on it, and the whole they were painted like a log cabin, and it was empty. And he took me down to the basement, and then he pounded some holes in the bottom of it with a nail so that it had air could get in, and then he stuffed some paper in there. And then he lit this paper and had you see the smoke come out from the chimney. I thought that was a real fine touch, you know. It's a funny thing, the kind of things that stick with you about your, about your father. And by the way, I think Mark does a lot of this with his children, and I think that's really good. He's extremely good about doing things with his boys and girls, and his girl, and I think that's an important part of life.
I got tent meetings, Sunberg, Wilmer.
Yeah, well, Dad used to hold tent meetings in a gigantic tent, and I can remember how lots of times this would be set up on a lot where there's pretty tall June grass growing, and we used to, when you walk up and down the aisles and stuff, they put these chairs in there. I can remember this grass in there and stuff. And we were in summer. Why, is this boring?
So it wasn't the sawdust trail, it was the grassland.
No, there wasn't sawdust. It was grass.
Do you remember those tent meetings at all, Harold?
No, not that early, no. I remember some later.
But Dad was always preaching someplace or other. And
You said gigantic tent, it probably wasn't very big.
now I can remember one of these other meetings that I don't know if I have that in there, but
What do you got in here, gold bullion?
Oh, where did you find that? Where did you find that thing?
I didn't find it, somebody else found it.
I bet it was stayed in one of the carts, because it got in
Yeah.
the cart. Yeah, it was down
within
below.
a cart. Why are we, all right, what else?
Okay, okay.
Which item are you on now?
Chair and, okay. Trapping muskrats.
Okay, well this, I don't know, we may have talked about this before, but.
Yeah, we did. We got that on the
Sure
other
we did.
tape.
Sure we did,
Yep.
let's skip that. Two-wheel something cart delivery, milk delivery.
Well, this was in South
Harris.
Dakota, where,
That's going back.
again, it's going back. Well, that's why I wanted you to organize.
Don't worry about it. Falling backwards on the merry-go-round.
That's also the South Dakota, see? So you should have organized it chronologically, if that's what you wanted.
Doesn't matter, this thing will never make Hollywood.
I'm not so sure about that.
No, that's okay.
This is pretty important
Oh,
stuff
yeah, might be. Might not be too.
compared to what.
Words on the merry-go-round.
Well, see, that's South Dakota, but I suppose I've recited that already too.
Yeah, we did. We got that under.
Okay, how about mother working at Webb's in Chicago?
Well, that's even going even
Talking
further
about it. Little boy she cared for standing up in church. I don't want Haben to marry Dee Dee.
That was a cute story.
Yeah, that's when they got
Helen
married.
knows
Is that on
that
the
one.
old one too? That's probably on the old one.
Well,
No, I don't think so.
Well, here we need to pick up a little history of the family, because Dad, as I mentioned before, Grandpa had 2 farms in Minnesota, and during the First World War, Grandpa didn't want Dad to go into service because he didn't want him to go to Europe and get killed. And so
Besides, he had 2 farms.
So he put him on one of these farms, and he got a deferment because he was. So Dad farmed like crazy. He was very hardworking, and he worked from sun up to sundown every day, and didn't take care of himself. So pretty soon he developed an ulcer and got real sick, and then he decided he started searching for God then at that time, and so he thought maybe it'd be easier if he got away from that ungodly Norway Lake. If he could get to school someplace, maybe he could have, it'd be easier for him to do this. And so he got into Red Wing Seminary. And what was the subject?
That was really a high school.
Yes, it was called a seminary, but it was a high school. He was a Christian.
And Grandpa had graduated from that high school years before. And so anyway.
You know that Clara and Hedvig went there too.
Yeah, right. Now, what was the subject of that item?
About mother marrying.
Oh, yeah. So then after where did he go to college then after he finished Red Wing Seminary?
St. Olaf.
Did he go to St. Olaf?
St. Olaf
For how many
College,
years?
And then Luther Seminary, of course.
Then he went to Luther Seminary.
Didn't he go to Concordia 1 year and St. Olaf twice?
I don't know.
2 years,
I
something
don't
like
know
that.
Anyway, I think he only had 3 years of college anyway. And then he went to the seminary. And in one of these years, either in seminary or in college, he went to Chicago with some of his classmates that he had met at school. And that's how he got involved with Mother, who was, because they attended Ebenezer Lutheran Church.
He did carpentry work
He
in
was doing
Chicago.
carpentry work during the summer, and he met Mother there. And so they eventually decided to get married, and when they got married in Ebenezer Lutheran Church.
Yes, they did.
Mhm. And so this little boy, who was apparently a child of the family that
Mother was working
Mother
for.
had worked for, he knew he was going to lose his good friend. Apparently Mother was extremely good to him. I'm sure she was, because she was a wonderful mother. And apparently he had stood up in the middle of the ceremony and had said, I don't want
Haben.
Haben to marry Dee Dee, because he didn't want to lose his Dee Dee. She was supposed to call Dee Dee. That's that story.
The next one was when Dorothy was born, and I am reported to have said, if it's another girl, I don't even want to see her.
That's why
I think that was Karen.
It could have, no.
No, that was at Adolph's
I
house.
think it was, no.
No,
She was born
Blanche.
in Adolph's house.
Ooh, Dorothy?
No, Karen, you said
Karen
Blanche,
was
didn't
born
you?
in St. Paul.
You said Blanche, didn't you?
No, Dorothy.
You think it was Karen that you said that about?
It was Dorothy. Because
Maybe
by
what-
that time there had been, how many girls? I don't know.
Well, in other words, you're agreeing with my item there.
Yes, you're trying to correct it and screw it all up there.
Helen was.
Dorothy came along. And I remember another occasion when this was on the farm, though, I think. And I came out in the morning and we have a new baby. I thought there was something going on. I probably didn't even know Mother was pregnant until that time. Thought there was something going on. There was probably a total bedlam going on all night in the house. I didn't even know.
There probably was.
Ma had me washing that stupid kitchen floor.
Children
Oh.
came with such regularity, it was startling.
That was startling to more people than once.
That's right.
Particularly startling to Grandpa.
Oh,
my,
yes.
yes.
Do we have that on the tape?
No, yes, we do, and let's not repeat it.
Oh,
It's one of those
okay.
horrible things. that
When
he's ever
Mark
said.
got age 2, hit his head on in the booth in the Martin.
Mark, no, that's Mark. That's when we were traveling across country. That's for Mark's benefit,
Oh,
if he ever sees this thing. But anyway, he thinks that's really funny, and it is funny.
What is it?
Well, Mark and his mother and I, we were traveling from Athens, Georgia to
Get your holy feet down.
Spokane, Washington. And I was in the service, and we stopped at this restaurant in Tennessee or someplace. I forget what the state was. And he hit his head on the booth, of course, and he just hurt it naturally, and so he just started screaming at the top of his lungs, and of course the whole restaurant, all our eyes were turned on me, and it was back in those days, I was very self-conscious anyway. If it had been now, I'd say, just settle down, folks, you'll be okay after a while. But I also remember that a patrolman stopped me on that same trip, and he said, I was speeding apparently, and he said, you want that boy in the back seat there today, don't you? He says, you just cool it, watch your speed limit. And of course, Mark was standing in the seat in the back, because in those days, we didn't have
No
seat
car
belts.
seat,
We didn't
that's
even think about seat belts. Anyway, that's all I just.
okay.
This is probably dull and
You
boring.
got the homemade cigarettes, we have that, did we have that on there, the homemade cigarettes?
Well,
last
Martin
time?
and I were always trying to manufacture homemade cigarettes, because we didn't know how to get a hold of a pack of cigarettes. Back in those days, there wasn't any danger of kids starting to smoke cigarettes because you couldn't get a hold of them. Even the butts, because the butts
They were stuck on the farm.
stuck on a farm. So we would try to manufacture these things, and one of the things you would use was corn silk and stuff. But I remember that one time, I think I've told this before, one time when I was mowing hay and Dad came down and took the sickle up to sharpen, and Martin came down. I don't know how he knew that I was going to be available. Anyway, he had brought the Makins along, and we were sitting there working on these, smoking these, what we thought were cigarettes. It was really funny why we would do that when we knew Dad was coming down after a very short time. And he came down through that woods, Helen, I was down by that slough, and we were sitting with our back to the farmhouse, and I guess looking out over the slough, and he came down and he had this oil can, and we had an oil can, and he could squirt the oil with it, the machinery. And he just reached, snuck up behind us, and he squirted oil on the end of our cigarettes. And he says, I don't want you boys to smoke. That's all he said.
Sure was, I'm sure.
Very effective.
I'm sure this grass had a wonderful,
taste.
taste.
Oh, it's awful.
How about when you were slapped in the mouth at the table? Everybody
Oh,
was
yes.
yelling?
Well, we had a large family, of course, and a big table, and Dad happened to be sitting at that particular time just the right distance down. There must have been one or two people between me and him with his long arm. He'd come around just like this, and of course, everybody was talking in the blue streak, and I was the loudest of the bunch, I'm sure. And he just came right around like that and whacked me right in the mouth. And of course, it was extremely embarrassing. That was the worst part of it.
Yeah.
Because, that quieted everybody down in a hurry, because they could see that I was in dire straits.
No doubt psychologically damaged for life.
Well, it's one of the traumas. Now,
That's right.
what this session so far today has lacked is a theme. Now, last
You're never going to find a theme.
well, yes, we did last time. It was my traumas, and I've got a lot of
The
them.
theme could be,
Now
why
that-
are the Christensens this way?
I think, well, before we get too carried away with running down the Christians,
But let me
I
tell you
think
a
they're a
story.
pretty fine family.
Oh, I'm just joking. But
But this traumas thing.
let me tell you a story though.
That's what I'm going to do for next
What?
year's. I'm going to start with the trauma thing. I'm going to try to remember the very
The
first one.
theme of the trauma thing. The
I
trauma.
want to go right. No, it's very important because you need to get this stuff out.
Oh, I got a Bible verse for you.
Now some people
Forgetting those things which are behind, press on.
that's called that's we call repression and
Oh.
See,
repression.
we don't believe in repression. We don't bring it all out.
No, there's some people like you're more concerned.
Let me tell you a story though.
No,
About,
I got to finish what I'm going to say about you. I think that you are more conservative than a lot of the members of the family.
I
Now,
am.
that's a thing that Helen and I have talked about quite a few times. There's certain members of the family that follow after Dad's
What do you mean
line,
by
and there's certain members that follow after Mother's line.
What do you mean by conservative? What do you mean by conservative?
I think you have more of a tendency to, more reserved is what I mean. you have more of a tendency to keep in things.
Not a chance.
The rest of us are more willing to share.
Well, I can tell you, I have a tendency to keep things in more than Pa did. I can tell you that right now.
Well, now that's a good example. If we take Dad as one standard.
He sets the mean. But you know, somebody.
Well, that's one of the things that's, give me that.
You know what people tell me about?
Give me that thing, I gotta fill this in about Pa, because Martin put this in his church book. Don't you
Oh,
suppose
that's
that
terrible.
sucker is down there? It's not here.
What's the matter now?
That bulletin of Martin's, I had it in here, see, but I kept it in the letter so you could see it. But Martin, in his church bulletin,
Oh, yeah, he
on
did.
for Father's Day, had put in all these things about Dad. And
Legacy.
And one of the things,
Oh,
the
wow.
legacy, and one of the things he put in there was Dad's honesty. Because Dad had put in, and had always said to us, whatever you do, be honest. And I think with Dad, it was more than just, whenever you open your mouth, make sure what you say is true. With him, it was, whatever you got in your mind, get it out.
Much to Mother's consternation. But I was talking about that.
And one of the examples of what he said, one of the examples of what he said, which I thought was just
Where are
classic.
you aiming,
He put
Helen?
this right in.
He's aiming at the wall.
One of the things he put in that bulletin about Pa, which I think is just classic, was that he was going to sell this car.
That's right.
And he says to the guy that was interested in it, he says, well, now there's something I want to tell you about this car. He said, it looks awfully good, but it's been driven hard. And that typifies him.
Well, see, he should have had honest paws, used cars. No, that's true.
And what were you going to say, Harold? Here he was going to say
I
something.
think he was the
I'm
most
trying-
honest person I have ever met, without a question.
Me too.
about it.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's just nobody that was as honest as he was.
That's true, although he probably had a few hang-ups that he wasn't aware of himself, but anyway,
Oh, do you think so?
that's life.
Oh, yeah. Well, maybe we should
I
start
mean
on,
about,
should we
you
start
know,
on your traumas now?
I mean about his motivations and
Maybe.
so on, he probably wasn't aware of that, you know. Well, anyway,
Yeah, now, for next year, maybe we should have you
No.
do
But
your
he's got,
traumas.
let him tell you.
I've been trying to say this for 5 times now. But I just wanted to throw in this little kicker about Pa. Oh, yeah, he wasn't afraid to talk about sex at all. And, you know, from his own experiences, he knew that people were hung up on this. And so he wasn't afraid to talk about it. But of course, he constantly got in trouble, because in those days, you just didn't talk about sex at all.
Oh, you know, yeah.
He was about 25 years ahead of time.
Well, that's what people say. He was ahead of his time, you know, because everybody's talking about it now. But 50 years ago, every
Yeah.
time he opened his mouth, he you know, was disgraced. And
Well,
that's part
yeah.
of the reason he got into trouble.
Oh, absolutely. Well, he
Oh.
knew that a big source of a lot of people's trouble was. And of course, Freud had brought this out centuries before, but people just hadn't really bought it, you know. And
Well, anyway, but I want to tell you a story about a boy who was at the table like you. Everybody was talking, and this boy stood up in his chair, and he said, "Shut up and give me the butter." And of course, you know, he was severely spanked. But somebody had a tape recorder going, and they played this, and they heard that he'd been asking for this butter for about 5 times, see, in an appropriate way, and nobody was paying any attention.
that's probably what
Sounds
my
like
problem.
the
That's probably
Christensens.
what my
Yes.
problem was.
Oh, I tell you, our table manners
And
were.
I think I finally left the table after that whapping across the mouth, because it was mighty embarrassing. And I'm glad I didn't get any broken teeth.
Well, our table.
And I don't recommend it that parents do this, and I think Dad was probably wrong in doing it, but I think he just got so frustrated that with all the noise. And
What about Mother's clear ringing testimony? Is that on the old?
Well,
tape?
that was Mother's way of saying she could tell whether somebody was a Christian or not, because they had a clear ringing testimony. And I don't know. That was just her expression.
That's right, but,
I never did think much about it until recent years, just what clear ringing meant.
oh, we had many ways of telling whether a person was a Christian or not. There were several clear-cut signs. If they ever had any lipstick, if they ever went to theater, played cards, danced, oh, that was, forget it.
No.
You were-
Oh,
You
absolutely.
were dissolute.
Well, one of the items that's in there, and we can jump over to it now, that fits in with what you said there is, I can remember the time when, what brought it to mind was the other day when Helen and I were, we heard on the radio, the Stars and Stripes Forever, John Philip Sousa's famous band number. And it reminded me of the time when, Dad took us to the county fair in Wilmer, Minnesota. He loved to go to these fairs for the healthy things that were there, but when they had the stage production, of course, even in those days, they had some girls up there that were dancing scantily clad. And I can remember him driving home and lamenting about that and telling us how wrong he thought it was that those women should be running around with practically nothing on and stuff like this. And I can remember Orland Mankel was with us that one time, and I remember how he disagreed and was arguing with Dad about whether or not that.
What was his theory?
His theory was that it was quite all right. But
Well, he's just a kid.
but getting back to the Norway community, we were pretty sure who was a Christian and who wasn't a Christian in that community, and the consensus was, as I gathered, was that there weren't very many Christians. There was maybe our family and.
I don't think there were very many people who went to church, were they?
Oh, they all went. Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Church
yeah.
was a big item. Church was a big item, but whether or not they were real believers, true believers.
Yeah.
And of course, there were a lot of signs of whether. But anyway, we'll get into that.
What about Pa and you at Sacred Heart for meetings?
Well, this is that one year when we drove. He was going to Sacred Heart to go to preach at some meetings with Mellum, who was a friend of ours, who wrote the Morning Glory all the time.
That's where we went for our glasses.
But yeah, oh, is that right? Yeah.
Well, I didn't
he's
have
an
any, but
optometrist.
Jeanette and Martin did.
But anyway, Dad took me along, and this one fall, and this was during the war when. This gets back to Dad's honesty. This was during the war when there was speed limits and everything to save tires and gasoline and everything. And of course, this Model A probably couldn't go much over 35 miles an hour, but that was the speed limit as I recall. And Pa asked me as we were driving to Sacred Heart, which wasn't all that far really. But anyway, he asked me if I would watch the speedometer and remind him if he went over 35 miles an hour because he wanted to stay within the law. Now let me tell you, this has a profound effect on a young man in terms of how he lives his life from that time on. I didn't do better.
That's the mystery. No, but you got crying due to homesick.
Thanks a lot.
Crying due to homesickness.
Oh yeah, well that's the time when it got so boring with all those old ladies and everything. We stayed with these two old ladies. And of course, Dad in the afternoon, he just went and took a nap, and then there I was, and I was so bored. I remember I went down to watch to the railroad tracks to watch this train. And the train had stopped at the station and was getting ready to leave, this freight train. So I took a penny and I went up and put it on the track to see what the train would do with the penny when it went over it. And after the train went past, I went up and it was, of course, all flat and everything. But then this guy came along with a handcar. He was down there. Station, and he saw me and came down his handcar, and he says, "You don't do that again." He says, "You can throw that train right off the track." So anyway, before the weekend was over, why I was crying because I was lonesome. And that's how. So I shouldn't be hard on any of these young kids that are lonesome because I was 10 years old then when I was lonesome.
This is
Okay. What I want to do now is something that, in case the young parents in our family have occasion to see this thing, I want to say something very important about their children. What I want to tell them is that it is extremely important that their children learn how to use, that is, speak and write the English language correctly, grammatically, and with a good vocabulary. I was talking about this a little bit. What brings this to mind is that we recently had a birthday party for Helen over at Karen's house, and Kim and Kevin and Danny Ashland were there. And we got talking about this, and it reminded me of the fact that when I went through high school, I wasn't inspired to learn the English language, how to write it, how to speak it, and to learn basically basic grammar. And so that when I tried to enter the University of Minnesota, they wouldn't let me in until I had taken a preparatory English course. And this little teacher, this preparatory English course, taught us every day we wrote a composition. Every class we had, and she corrected it and showed us that whether the sentences were complete and all the rest of the stuff. And I found that this was the biggest advantage that I had in my career in the Navy and in banking in years to come. And I think it's the biggest lack that most kids coming out of schools these days have. And therefore, I would suggest that anyone who has young children, if they don't know how to teach them themselves and find out whether they can speak and write the English language, I suggest that they get a tutor and have their children learn that, because it's that important to a successful career. That's the end of the speech.
Okay, I can add something to that. When I was going to start college, I had been extremely unmotivated student in high school. And when I was going to start college, I knew I didn't know grammar and stuff like he's talking about. So I found an old English book, grammar book, that summer before I entered college. I just, read through this book and studied it. I learned more grammar in just a few hours than I learned all the way through high school. So when I got into college, I didn't have any problem at all. They had English there, but I didn't, because I anticipated that. So you're absolutely right about that. We got to talk about, this is, by the way, the title is Giant Twitchy Roofs, Part 2.
Right.
And long story about that one. But 1725 Van Buren, Karen falling on the floor, off the table.
Well, I understand that Karen, I can remember her falling off that kitchen table when we lived in St. Paul. Karen was born there in St. Paul, and she was just a baby, and I guess they washed her on the table and stuff. But I can remember her falling off that table onto the floor. And I don't know why she didn't get hurt worse than she did. But
Grandpa J.S. raving about Ma's brown bread.
well, that was one of the things that I can remember very distinctly. Is Grandpa, he just thought Mother's brown bread was the greatest thing that was ever invented. And
It was,
he
too.
was pretty critical of Mother in many ways, particularly because she didn't milk cows and stuff. But boy, when it came to her bread, he just thought that was the greatest thing in the world. And he just loved to come over there and get a cup of coffee and a piece of that bread. And anyway, that's all on that. I don't know what else.
What is the childhood trauma? Games like Uncle Harold, chunk of wood. And
Oh, that I thought about that last night. This. You know, I don't know whether you guys do it or not, but I lots of times will go back and think about experiences I had as I grew up. And I learned an awful lot about myself from this one experience. There was a time when Uncle Harold came out to visit us, and we lived in Adolph's house, and we spent a lot of time down. We had a lake right near the house, and we used to go and swim down there all the time. And he came down there, and Helen was acting normally, and everybody else acting normally. But for some reason, I didn't think I was getting enough attention or whatever. There was this big chunk of wood, not too big or not too heavy, but it was a piece of wood, driftwood that had floated ashore, and I was taking this over, and of course it was all sandy and everything, and wet and sandy, and I was putting it on him, see.
On his shoulders.
And do you remember that, Helen?
Oh, yes.
And anyway, he finally gave me a spanking over that because I wouldn't stop, of course. And then I started to pout, and I withdrew. And I remember that evening, the family was planning a picnic down by Rusted's resort, which was only about 3 blocks down the road. And I can remember walking in the ditch way behind. The rest of the family was ahead. But the other thing that struck me about that was the fact that I knew that that's the only place I had to go, so I had to somehow or another get back into the family group. And I could sense the fact that the family was grieving too because I wasn't there, and that they wanted me back into that group, and they were trying to figure, and when I finally got enough courage to get close enough to get to the table and everything, I remember how everybody, isn't that funny how families do that?
Reminds me of the Waltons.
And
What about the $5